Thank you guys for coming. My name is Eddy Ashioya, and I am happy to be here. Now, just as an icebreaker, I'll start with a joke and not practice it sharp. But, so a man goes to a funeral and asks the widow, "Can I say a word?" And the widow says, "Sure." The man stands up and says, "Plethora." Then the widow says, "Thank you, that means a lot." No? No? It will load when it loads. So today we have Shubnum Khan, a South African author and artist. Her first novel, Onion Tears, was shortlisted for the Penguin Prize for African Writing and the University of Johannesburg Debut Fiction Prize. Her writing has also appeared in the New York Times, Mark Sweeney's HuffPost, Oprah Magazine, The Sunday Times, Marie Claire, and others. She has a degree in media studies and a master's in English from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Her essay collection, How Accidentally Became a Stock Photo, was published in South Africa and India in 2021. The Djinn Waits 100 Years is her debut novel in the UK. Karibu, Kenya.
Asante.
Yes, that's how, your Kiswahili is not so bad. That's how people describe you, but what's it like being you?
It's nice. I'm at a I'm at a stage in my life where I like being who I am, so it's good.
It's good. Okay. We'll go into the questions. Out there we are discussing the questions, and I think we agree that we have too many questions and too little time, so we'll try and cover as much as possible with what you have. By just a show of hands, apart from the students, how many have read the book, The Djinn Waits 100 Years?
Okay, by the end of it, I'm going to make you all want to read it. I hope.
Yes. It's, how do you describe the book, Shab?
It's a African Gothic novel about a haunted house on the east coast of South Africa. And it's about a house that is haunted, but also the things that haunt us.
Speaking of the things that haunt us, when I read the book, I didn't focus so much on the Gothic nature, but on the love story. Perhaps that says more about me than about the book in itself.
No, I think I wanted to write a love story, a ghost story, a tragedy all mixed in one. And I think that's how it became a Gothic. I didn't think it was a Gothic novel when I wrote it, but afterwards people told me, of course it's Gothic, it's got tragedy, it's got love. And so I really wanted to write a kind of love story from the beginning.
Were you borrowing more from fiction or from reality? Hint, hint.
Yeah, both.
But perhaps my first question would be, how do you recall in such vivid details events that happened way back in the past, just to be able to juxtapose because the book happens in two timelines, 1932 and 2014. And for you, how are you able to recollect such details?
I mean, I'm not because it's fiction, so I'm making it up. But like, I think the reason why, because I'm often described as writing very detailed descriptions, and I don't know, but I know I'm drawn to that kind of writing. Like Arundhati Roy is a god of small things. Like from the time I read that, I remember thinking there's so much of detail, it pulls the reader right in. And I want to try to do that with my writing. And I think also I draw. Like one of the things is that I'm an artist. And I draw very detailed drawings. And I think also something must come from that, being able to think as an artist and then to draw and then to write as a writer. I think I'm interested in drawing details and I'm interested in writing details because I think also the more detailed you get in your writing, the more universal the writing becomes. You know, I think often people think if you write vaguely about a culture or a place, then anybody can relate to it. But I do think if you get more into the detail of a place and the feeling, like Durban is really hot and tropical from where I am, it's actually very similar to Nairobi, or at least I feel like it's very similar in the 2 days that I've been here. But I feel like if you give more detail about a religion or a culture or a family, the more anyone in any other religion or culture or place relates to that, because they can apply themselves to the actual details. So I think that's why I write, or I try to recall details in vividly.
In the book, we see that Sana, especially, she's drawn to shapes and pictures. As I find my notes, how she interprets the world is that she goes into the features and the shapes. Like, for instance, the one that I do remember is when in a wedding, I think she was recalling a wedding. She was at a wedding and the two people were kissing. Is this PG for kids? The kids were kissing. Oh, no, the kids. The bride and the groom were kissing, and for her, it was her interpretation of love, how two people become one. How important have shapes been for you in your writing?
So the main character, Sana, doesn't speak very well. She's not good at being able to articulate herself properly. Whenever she tries to talk, she feels like the words can't come out of her mouth, and so she starts seeing the world in shapes. And when she sees love for the first time, it's two people kissing on a stage at a wedding, and she sees them as one shape. And then she starts identifying everything through love. She becomes obsessed with the idea of love because she wants to see this one shape when two people become one shape. I don't know how much shape. I mean, obviously, I think about shape as a writer myself, but I think I was more interested in seeing how Sana sees it. She's a 15-year-old girl, she's trying to figure out life. She's trying to understand what does things mean, and I think I was interested in seeing things from her eyes, from those 15-year-old eyes, like, what does it mean when people fall in love? Like, what is this love thing? When you're young, you're trying to figure out what is it? And so I think from her perspective, I was trying to figure out, what do shapes mean when you don't have words?
Okay. Sana herself has always been enchanted by love, as you correctly put it, collecting stories and memorabilia since childhood. She looks for love everywhere she goes, in the people, in the house, and she grows closer to the residents of Akbar just to find out what's the interpretation of love. Asking on behalf of Sana, what do you think love is? And how did your concept of love change as you wrote throughout the process of writing the novel?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because the book took me like 8 years to write. And so what I thought love was, and when I started the book, and what I think love is now is completely different. So Sana, as I mentioned, wants to find out what love is. She's 15, she's going to be 16. She wants to understand, what does it mean when two people love each other? Like, are they in love forever? And I think when I was younger, I always had this idea of like, you meet the one. And I'm conscious also that there's young people in the audience who also are like, yes, the one, we're going to meet the one. And I always felt like that also. But I think as I'm older, I realized that you can fall in love with many people at many times in your life, including your friends. And those are all important things too. I think so much of emphasis is placed on romantic love being the ultimate goal in life. And I grew up in a house where I was taught, like, we're saving the pots for when you get married, we're putting it away. We're saving the recipe books, we're saving the Tupperwares. Marriage is your ultimate goal in life, to find the one. And for me, as I got older, I didn't find the one. Or at least I thought I found the one, but that was not the one. But I didn't get that love story that I was waiting for, and I was waiting for, and I was waiting for, and I was like, they're in my community, but also I think in life, like, especially for young girls, you're telling them that this is your goal in life, and then what happens if you don't find it? Like, that's dangerous. It's really dangerous to put that expectation on people and to think the world revolves around that. It doesn't. And so I was interested exploring love through Sana, trying to understand what love is, and then relating that to me personally. I was also trying to explore it for myself. Like, that's why there's so many characters. There's like 6 characters in the present, there's like 8 characters in the past, because I'm exploring love through mother and daughter, sister and sister, father and daughter, first wife and second wife, like all these different ways, because I myself am so curious to understand what does it mean, and what does it mean when you lose love? Like, I'm always fascinated, how can 2 people be in love and like obsessed with one another, and the next day they don't want to know each other, they hate each other? Like, how does such an intense feeling disappear? And so really, quite honestly, the book is just an exploration of me trying to figure it out, through Sana, who's also trying to figure it out.
But it's not only Sana who has a love story in this book. There is Akbar, the patriarch, who loves Mina, who he takes upon as a second wife, but we find that their love is very violent and very chaotic, at least to my interpretation. But the jinn too, which is quite silent throughout the novel, perhaps we'll speak about that later. The jinn too is enchanted by Sana, but cannot be able to share his feelings towards Sana. Was the jinn's love true, despite never being able to truly speak about it, or to tell Mina that, or be known by Sana? What does Mina, not Sana? What does love need for it to be true? And can you really love someone and let them go if you never told them that you love them? Because Sana essentially says that love is a thing that stayed.
So the jinn is in love with Mina, who is the second wife of Akbar. But the jinn cannot speak. And the jinn, for me, is just an example of what grief looks like and unrequited love looks like if you just give into it. You don't try to fight it. You just accept that you have fallen in love with someone who will never love you back. And it just becomes the epitome of grief. It's just a character that walks around the house crying, wailing, looking for this woman that's died, doesn't care about any of the other characters. It's not trying to save itself. And so for me, I was trying to explore, what does love look like if you don't try to save yourself, you just fall and you let yourself fall. And the jinn is a really sad character. It starts looking like the woman that it fell in love with. She had one of the reasons why she died was her leg was hurt, and so the jinn limps and walks. The jinn starts growing hair like her. The jinn starts growing nails like her. Its face changes into her face. And I was just trying to explore what does that look like if you just turn into the person and you just mourn the person that you love. And then to answer your question about what does love look, what was the last part?
What does love need for it to be true?
What does love need for it to be true? And to answer your question also, I think the jinn's love is true. The jinn's love is not it's not human. I was also trying to explain that this is not a human character. To be human would mean to try to save ourselves and try to escape the situation. But the jinn is not a human character. It's not trying to save itself. And there was another question there also.
Can you really love someone, even if you never told them,
yeah.
and hope that your love was true?
Absolutely. I sometimes think that it's the most love if you don't tell someone, because then you're not burdening with them with that if you know they're not going to love you back, but you know you love them. So for me, I think that is love. Even if you don't tell someone, why is it not love if it's still there. Love is a thing that you carry in you. It doesn't have to be that you both carry in yourself. So yeah.
Sana's love is rooted in grief. Perhaps she was sold a shorthand from the beginning. And we see this in the point where her clothes hang on to herself. I think she says, like an unmothered daughter. Would you, if you can comment on it, would you say that Sana's search for love was more of a search for meaning? And in that meaning was trying to find out, why did my mother never really love me? Because there's some sort of resentment between Sana and her mother. While the father is grieving for the wife, Sana is grieving for her mother.
Yeah, and that's part of the exploration of love. Like in the whole entire novel, Sana doesn't think her mother loved her. And her mother has passed away, so she can't even reconcile that relationship. she only has what she's left with, which is that her mother used to leave her in the bath when she was young and forget about her, never cook for her, like didn't care about her. And Sana has this dead sister who's following her around, telling her, our mother never loved us, our mother never looked after us, our mother was a horrible human being. But I think by the end of the novel, she realizes that her mother wasn't horrible. Her mother was just a complicated woman. And when you get older, you begin to understand that, you know, Sana's father describes her mother as a flower that he picked from a field and he tried to put her in a vase. And she just wasn't meant to be there. It didn't mean she didn't love anyone less, but she was just someone who didn't know how to be a mother, whatever that means. And so I think that's also what I want to explore in the novel is complicated women who are given these roles and just assumed by society that you can take these roles. But it doesn't mean that you're a bad person if you can't do it. You know, people are complex, people are nuanced, and that's what I try to show with the writing.
Bilal, Sana's father, tries to run from his grief. All his life we see him trying to run away from where he came from to come and find a place where he can rest his heart. While Sana herself is so attached to her grief that it shows up in the form of her dead sister. Sana was only a child when her mother died, but they were never close. I am intrigued by your interpretation of motherhood. Akbar's mother uses motherhood as a weapon. Jahanara, Akbar's first wife, uses it as a status symbol, and Mina as a gift for her husband. What's your interpretation of motherhood?
I mean, also like how I was exploring love, I think I was just exploring motherhood in the novel, like the different ways. And I love that you point out all the different characters, that motherhood means a weapon, or motherhood means a status symbol, or motherhood means love as someone who's caring for something that you've put in the world. And I think I'm not a mother, but I'm always interested in understanding what it means. And I think that's the beauty of being a writer, is that I can get to explore it through different characters in different ways. And also by showing that there's many different ways of being a mother and the different ways it shows up in life. Yeah.
I'd like to inform the audience that you can get ready to ask your questions in the next 10 minutes as we wind up the other questions with Shab. In that interpretation of motherhood, I think, I don't know if it's part of the culture, I'm not very familiar with it, but I know there's a sense that a son never questions the mother, right? In the sense of Akbar, whatever the mother said, really, she was the matriarch. The father, Akbar as the patriarch of the house, his job was to make the money and left the running of the home to the women, so to speak. And there was all this tension that perhaps led to Mina's death. How have this, at the risk of reducing it to societal roles, influenced how much of your culture that you borrowed into the book, and especially us, because when Akbar is talking about, or rather is very far removed from the running of the house, yet he is basically the house. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think my culture, but I think many cultures, there's, you know, the patriarchal idea of the son who is revered in the family as compared to the daughters, which I have seen in not in my family, I don't have any brothers, but in an extended family, where the son is just given the role of, and especially like I think in Indian communities where I'm from, is the daughters are just not given the same attention as the sons. And Akbar is, in this novel, Akbar is the mother's baby. Whether he grows up into become a man, she feels like she can control everything in his life, and he lets her, to a point. I think when he wants to get married to the second wife, she has a breakdown, and she's like, you can never get married to a second wife. She's not a Muslim. How can you do this to our family? She's from a lower caste. She works in our factory. Like, this could never be. And he does insist that he wants to get married. But I mean, I think obviously I was drawing from these patriarchal roles that I saw in the society around me.
Would you consider yourself a multicultural person?
Me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. If then you do consider yourself multicultural, have you likewise struggled with the culture you inherited and the culture you grew up around? When Johanara, who says she was born Indian but she's English through and through, and she often thinks that she was born into the wrong skin. And while that may have come off simply as said in passing, it's actually a kind of big thing where who we are vis-a-vis what we think we are always at odds with ourselves. What might that struggle be rooted in, and how does it manifest in your journey?
I mean, and also for me, my grandfather came from India like in the 1930s. And so I grew up in a very like Indian family in South Africa, which is, again, two very different cultures, two very different backgrounds. And I think growing up, especially because I lived with my grandfather and he would talk about India and coming on the journey and sort of like, we need to keep the culture alive. Like growing up, I was like, oh, wait, what am I? Am I Indian or am I South African? And only when I grew older, I think I realized, oh, I can be both. It's fine. Like that's cool. Like I can find who I am. But I think I struggled with it for a while because even like growing up, my grandfather would support India in cricket, and then my father would support South Africa, I mean, after apartheid, not before apartheid. But, it was that you always had this tension of like, who are you? Where do you belong, And then to add to that, we were watching American films and reading English books, and then there's that whole other identity of like, what are you? Are you Western? Are you African? Over and above thinking, am I South African? Am I Indian? I mean, and I think everybody struggles with this identity thing. And I would read books about like Enid Blyton about the snow in winter, and I was like, why don't we have snow in winter here? And that's why the opening of the book, I made it very clear that if you see the opening lines, it's just because I want to emphasize this. No one in Durban remembers a Christmas as hot as this, is the first line. Because I wanted to say, we're in the global south, and we have winter in summer here. We have Christmas in summer here. It's boiling hot. And then I go on to talk about the weather. Because I think part of my identity struggle when I was younger was reading all these English books and thinking, that Christmas was a winter thing. And I know, I grew up where it's boiling hot on Christmas Day. We're sweating, we're eating watermelons, we're walking in our vests and our shorts in summer, and we're going to the beach. And I think and there's so many writers who do this, and they're here at this festival as well, when we write our stories from our places, we help a little bit with that identity thing. Like I would have, I think, been a little bit more settled with who I was growing up if I was reading more stories about our people in our places, And so to answer your question about struggling with identity, a lot of it was what I was watching, a lot of it was what I was reading and hearing around me. And it helps when you have things around you to guide you to who you are inside. And so literature is part of that. And that's also just to make a comment about why these festivals are so important. Yeah.
Fantastic. That segues us into a book reading, and one of my favorite chapters was when Sana and the father are talking about home. Page 6, if you have your book.
We know you'll all have your books with you. From where? Until they were starting there. Okay. Sana Malik winds down her window and searches for a breeze. The dark curtain of hair flies off her neck to reveal her mother's chin, and she turns this way and that as she struggles to make it her own. She is neither girl nor woman, hovering in that space between the two where, At the edge of her thoughts, curling at the eaves, is the glimpse of a flattering light that promises something wonderful, a knowledge that the world is going to change. She carries it close to her chest like a secret box. She is going home. It is not really home, but her father says it is because he believes it. He says home can be many places, even places you haven't been before. He says home can also be a memory if you return to it enough. Sana wants to know exactly how many times you have to return to make memory home. And her father says you will know when it happens. Which isn't really an answer, but she accepts it anyway. She accepts many things about him, like the fact that he lives by a collection of axioms of his making. Home can be a memory, rivers are more reliable than roads, and the ground keeps problems in. She accepts he will never be like the fathers she reads about, strong-minded and determined, wearing suits and cracking knuckles. She accepts that without her mother, he has lost some anchor, and like a ship, he has strayed off into uncharted waters. And so when he announces one morning that he has finally found home, she is not surprised and simply packs up and leaves with him in their Isuzu. Since her mother's death 4 years ago, her father has become obsessed with coastal towns, marking cities along maps. He studies weather graphs and learns about the histories of towns along the South African coast. The West Coast, he says, has many good things, like mussels and otters and small wild roads, but it is cold and windy, and there are too many white people. You can't trust a place with too many white people, he says. The East Coast has warmer waters, smoother stones, and a bright sun, and warm places help you forget the past. They help you leave behind the painful things, he adds. When they enter the city, the salt hits the air and a streak of blue skims the horizon. They work their way towards the ocean, passing little shops, conference centers, and brick buildings, and come to a knot of streets filled with graffiti, the smells of cooking food and blaring foreign music. As they move past Nigerian pawn shops and Somali haberdasheries, African immigrants give way to Asian ones as Pakistani chicken tikka stalls emerge between Chinese fashion outlets. Further down, Indian immigrants adjust the signs of their small spice stores, shift uneasily away from the crowds of new foreigners trying to make it clear they are not as fresh off the boat. They tack signs onto their storefronts that say, "Estimated 1918, and mutter about the good old days when everything did not come from China, when customers fill their store searching for quality cloth and spices."
Not everything comes from China, though. What is it, as Sana is searching for her idea of home, and the father perhaps is also searching for his own idea of home, what is your idea of home, and how is it an abstract being?
Home changes all the time. That's what I've learned, the idea of home. So for me, when I was young, home was where my family was, and that was home, wherever that was. But I think now home has changed into a place where I feel most free. So home can be a place I don't even know yet, because I might go somewhere and feel completely free, feel like who I am. And so home is also a place that's waiting for me somewhere, and it can change all the time. Home is also like my car when I'm on the road and I've got a certain song on and I feel like I'm on the road and I'm free. So I like the idea, and I believe that home is a changing thing as life goes on.
Any questions from the audience? We'll have 1, 2, 3. So we start with him. Please, let's keep our questions short and taut. No comments. Yeah. Mine is a comment, is not a question.
First of all, congratulations. My name is George Seymour. I'm from Mombasa, a writer writing my 4th book. So my question is very simple. What are some of the challenges you face while writing these amazing books? And what advice can you give authors just starting out to write such deep love meaning books like you have written? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a great question. So this book took about 8 years, and I was telling Eddy earlier that I almost gave up on it many times because nobody wanted it at one point. I was trying to apply to agents, also because, you know, most of the literary agents are in the US and the UK, and for some reason, they're not really interested in our stories. In South Africa, in Africa, it's really hard to get a literary agent. And I was just getting rejected and rejected. And I'd been working on this novel for so long. I was working through this novel when, for like the first four years of this novel, probably I was very depressed. So it was the only thing that was keeping me going at the time. And I was just getting rejected. I had a whole Excel sheet of people that I'd applied to, and I had been previously published in South Africa, but it didn't seem to matter. And so there were many times when I was like, this is a crap novel, nobody wants to read it, it's too complicated. People keep saying they can't identify, they can't relate to it, and I almost gave up. But I do think there was like this, and I describe it as like a little fire that you have to keep alive in your chest, even when you feel like, you know, it's the end and it's not going to work out. Because I say it took me 8 years, but it didn't take me, I wasn't writing for 8 years in a row. I was putting it away one side and giving up on it, and then coming back to it. Something would always draw me back to it. And you have to keep, I always say you have to keep that fire burning, that little fire, whatever it is, because I'd keep giving up and then being like, but there's something here. I feel that there's a story here, and it's important to me. And I want to try to fight for it. So I just had to keep that feeling alive and the motivation. And also just like coming here for these festivals and hearing all the writers speak and coming to the talks is part of you fighting for yourself, fighting for your craft, fighting for the love of it, right? Because it's not always something that's taken seriously. Like certainly not in my family, being an Indian girl and telling people, you know, and I mean now it's more common, but I started writing like 15 years ago. In my early 20s, I was telling people I wanted to be a writer, and that wasn't taken seriously. They were like, get married, have kids. Writing is not as serious, it's a hobby, you know? And I had to keep telling myself, it's not a hobby, you have to take it seriously, go for talks, do online courses where you can. I had to keep fighting to make it happen. And so I think that's just, especially for something like art, it's something you have to really like, hold it within you and hold it as precious and fight for it. Otherwise, it's very easy to give up. Yeah.
So I have two questions. One is, when do you get the best out of yourself? I found that usually when I'm depressed, I'm suffering, I'm struggling, that's when I have a lot to say. Or sometimes it's when I'm comfortable and I'm happy and I'm around my family and I want to write nice things about them. So when do you get the best out of yourself? Do you need to be suffering, and are you like a suffering artist? Or are you the kind who wants to be comfortable and free and have your coffee on your table and you're calm? When do you get the best out of yourself?
That's such a good question. I think when I'm suffering, as well, put it that way, when I'm going through something terrible, I can't think straight. I don't even know what's going on. I never know what's happening in that moment. I would never be able to write in that moment. I mean, for me, it depends on how intense it was, but it takes me, if it was something really terrible, like I find that I'm only able to write now about something that happened 5 years ago. Retrospect is like the best way of being able to reflect on what happened clearly. Because when I'm in the moment, I don't know what's going on, but I can see the bigger picture in retrospect. So I can only write about something quite long after it's over, or I can only feel inspired by it much later. I don't necessarily have to be very comfortable and happy and in a good place, but I just have to be out of that place to be able to write about it. Okay. And that's how it works for me. But I mean, I know writers who get really mad and probably just sit at the table and start so inspired and just start writing one way. I don't work that way, but I think there are writers who do that.
Okay. And then the second question is, who are your favorite authors? Which writers inspire you?
I mean, and I mentioned I'm very inspired by Arundhati Roy, just by personally and politically. And you know, I was 21 when I read The God of Small Things, and I feel like I didn't know what writing was until I read that book. Because it showed me you can do anything with language. You can make your own language, and you can make your own world. And everybody has their own world and language that they can bring in. And I really, that blew my world open in a way as a writer I didn't know. And that's also why I encourage, especially younger writers, to read as much as possible. Because you don't know what will work for you. There's different writers that will work and inspire you. But
could you maybe name one or two books?
The what?
One or two books that you love?
The God of Small Things, A Spell of Good Things by Ayobami Adebayo. There's also a South African author, Mohale Mashigo, who has a book called Intruders, which I think is just changing what we think about writing. It's about ordinary people doing fantastical things in South Africa, like the taxi driver who, grows wings and starts flying. And I think we have to start thinking of, out of the box in ways of how ordinary people can be doing extraordinary things. Those are some titles.
Okay, thank you.
We had her behind her.
Thank you. Mine is not as deep as the rest. I'm curious about the characters. I know from Onion Tears, Hadija was inspired by your late aunt. May she rest in peace. So I'm curious in the Jinn, how many other characters were inspired by people close to you? And particularly, I asked this because Bilal was one of my favorite characters, and he is such an odd character. And for you to even write that, it feels like it has to stem from that odd uncle somewhere or that odd neighbor. So are there any characters inspired by people close to you?
So my first novel, Onion Tears, got a lot of, this is not live streaming, so I can tell you all the secrets. Got a lot of backlash from my family, which was you based so many characters on different people in our family. And so when I write a second novel, I am going to make sure nobody can ever say anything was based on anyone. And that's why the novel got so fantastical and magical, because I was trying to get out of reality as much as possible. There's a lion tamer, and there's a man there's a dead sister. I try to make it as far as away from people who would identify themselves. So I hope I don't have an answer to the question to say that I was inspired by anyone around me, maybe subconsciously, but I really tried to stay away from anyone that I knew, because I just never wanted anyone to ever come to me and say, you put me in your book. Which I think everybody is in everybody's book somehow, just very hidden. So I probably hid it really well. But I really wrote Bilal, the father character, because I wanted to have a good male character in my novel, which sounds odd, but I didn't have that in my first novel, and I got a lot of questions about it. And I have so many female characters always in my novels, in my first one, and in this one, there's so many female characters. And I wanted to have a man who he doesn't have too much of a role in the novel, but he loves his daughter, and he tries to do the best that he can. And it felt important for me to do that in this novel. Just because I never did it, and I always stayed away from male characters, and they always were bad somehow in my novels. And the djinn was inspired by grief. The djinn was just inspired by my own grief and by the grief I saw around me. And if you could put a face to grief, then that was the djinn. Yeah.
We'll take one final here.
Hi, my name is Rafiq, and I was born in South Africa as well. And I left when I was a little child, came to Kenya. And I have a particular question. I was trained as an anthropologist, And I realized when I was 12 years old that I had a very strong Afrikaner accent, very strong. And I noticed your accent is not very South African. It's a softer, more Indian kind of accent, and I'm curious. I deliberately extinguished as much as I could whatever sounded South African in my voice because of apartheid and all that. Did you have any similar sort of desire to get away from something, extinguish something, amputate something like that? Or you were...
Which part did you grow up in South Africa?
Pretoria.
Yeah, but you see, you were in Pretoria, that's why.
Okay.
I was in Durban, so I was on the East Coast, which is, where only had Indian people around me, and because of apartheid, I was in a previously Indian area, so the schools, even though apartheid ended like when I was probably like 11, I still was still living with Indian people around me, going to schools that were previously Indian, so I probably got the accent from there. Pretoria now, that's the heart of like Afrikaner place, so that's probably where my accent, and also in terms of like consciously cutting off anything related to that, that's an interesting question. I don't think I did that, again, because I was in the community that I was living in growing up. I only started interacting with other races, which sounds so odd because I'm in South Africa, in university. And that's when I feel like everything opened up for me, because otherwise I was in such a contained community. And because of the community I was in, but also because of the area I was living in and what that exposed me to, the library, the school, the high school, that, it just stayed very contained for me. So I didn't feel like I needed to cut off anything, if anything. And also, I was pretty young when apartheid ended, so I didn't feel like I needed to consciously, yeah.
I just want to say one more comment, that I was really inspired by your writing about home. It's such a big thing, and you've really inspired me very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to get back to you, but there's something is asked that I want to throw Shab into the deep waters. But I'll segue it from the book I'll borrow from the book where there's a lot of tension in the colonization. Mina seems to see the forest for the trees, but Johanara bows at the altar of the British Empire. Akbar suffers her westernization, right? But yet gladly benefits from colonialism. He gets rich from underpaying people, right, guys? He gets rich from underpaying people, but as the apartheid ends, Sana inhabits a world where the past holds tremendous sway over the present. The house may be in ruins, but its occupants cannot escape it nor improve it, merely just survive it. Is that the perfect photograph of the human condition facing African countries? We are shackled to our histories while bowing to our futures. We see it in Africa Kills a Son by Ken Saro-Wiwa. We also see it by anything written by Dambutso Marechera. Is that the existential angst of Africa?
And there was also, how do we face this? Or how do we look to answer this question? I think as writers, and I think particularly for me in my story, is that it doesn't mean we have to look back on history as being hopeless. I think when I write, let's just talk it from my perspective. When I write, I try to take control of the narrative of what happened before. So in my story, there's an Indian family that comes and takes over a sugarcane factory, which would have been impossible in South Africa in the 1930s. But for me, I'm giving that power back to my characters. I made them powerful. They're a rich family, they're a rich Indian family, which was not typical. But as a writer, I can do that. So I can go back for me and give power to people maybe that didn't have people. And that's the power of fiction, I think. Taking back the stories. So it's not hopeless for me. I like this idea. There was a question yesterday we had in the crowd when they said the sea is history, this topic of the sea is history. And one of the questions was, what does sea is history mean to you? And someone said, well, the sea took away so much from us in terms of like slave labor, and it took away so much away from us. But I think this topic of the sea is history is reclaiming what they took away from us. And I do feel like writing fiction, for me, is like reclaiming that what we lost somehow and giving a power back that wasn't possible before. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my way of interpreting it.
Okay. Just to borrow from that, I'm going to come to the audience with 3 final questions, and then we can close. But just to pull that thread further, we see, especially in Africa, there's the trajectory that has been defined as moving from the margin to the center, in being that an upcoming writer or a writer moves from Lagos, Nairobi, Durban, goes to Paris, New York, or London, more or less leaving home to go and so that they can make it. What's your perspective, and do you think a writer especially needs to leave home to accomplish something?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question also, because in terms of this novel, this is the first time I have an internationally published novel. My other 2 books were only published in South Africa, and I think about this question often, like, what does it mean? Do you have to leave? Look, if I didn't live where I lived, I wouldn't be able to write this book that I wrote, and I wouldn't be able to get where I am if I'm not where I am now. I stay in Durban, I stay in South Africa, I've stayed there my whole life. So home is important to me. And it's great when your story goes out in the world. It's always better to have a bigger audience, to be able to talk to more people. But I wouldn't be where I am without where I come from. And that's important to me. I went to New York for a book event in May, and I had to search through the bookshops to find my book. And I came home and I landed in South Africa, and I remember on the book table at the bookstore, Exclusive Books, on the front table was a whole pile of my books. And I remember thinking, there's no place like home. Like here, they know me, they know what I'm talking about instantly when I talk about the weather, when I talk about who I am, or I'm trying to explain what it is to be Indian and South African. And so it's important, it's good to be out there, but I think as I got older, I realized how important it is to also have the recognition from where you're from. That's the most important thing.
You had a question? 2 more? Okay, we'll take from the students. Go first and then the students.
Okay. Hi, Shubnum. A wonderful conversation. Thank you both. I just wanted to pick up on the South Africa thread, and I know South Africa is such a complicated place. I mean, all places are complicated, but it's complicated in like in a really intense way. And I just wanted to, in the sense of the literary scene, I just wanted to know where a writer from Durban of your origin is sort of placed. South African literature is very much read, it's international, it's read internally, outside, et cetera, but I haven't encountered folks with your specific identity, and I wanted to know if you're paving the way or if you're one of the early ones. I've seen the films of the urban films, but not read as much the literature, so.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great question. And that's why one of the reasons why I wrote about Durban was because I felt like it's such an undersold city. Nobody talks about it much compared to Johannesburg and Cape Town. And there's a lot of literature coming out of Johannesburg and Cape Town. There's a lot of authors there. I mean, there's definitely books in Durban, but the story doesn't get told enough. And there's so much magic there for me. It's, it's like, it's such a tropical place with so much of stories, and there's like a flavor to the air there, if I can explain it, and the green is so luscious. But I keep talking about the green, but since I came to Nairobi, I'm like, oh, it's as green, it's more green. What am I talking about Durban being so special? The Nairobi is so special. So I feel a bit deflated about the green that I talk about in Durban. Since I came to Nairobi, I'm like, crap, this green is everywhere. It's not only in Durban. Yeah, we have the ocean. So I did think, I've been stuck there. I'll say stuck because there were many times I tried to leave when I couldn't. And I eventually I realized I'm in the city for so long and there's something here and I need to write about it. Again, that's also why the first line is, Durban didn't know Christmas as hot as this or something, because I also was like I'm telling you a story about Durban, and this is a story about a place that doesn't get told about much. But there are definitely writers there in the city. They don't get the same opportunities. It's also a city where it's creatively stifled, so people leave. It's not often that the writers stay in Durban. It has produced many writers, but they leave for the bigger cities or they leave for other countries where the opportunities are better. And I can understand that. But it's not a story that's told often, and that's a good observation, yeah.
Short questions.
My question is from the book, and the question is, who is your favorite character? How is he or she your favorite character, and how did you feel writing about this character?
I wrote a character named Zuleika who lives in the top of a tower and plays the piano and is considered a bit crazy. And I like her the most because it was the first time I was writing a character who just existed for herself. She didn't have any expectations to be married, to have kids, to be, she did suffer heartbreak, but I think it just loosened who she was from herself. And so I liked writing her because she didn't give a damn about anybody. Sorry, can I say damn in her kids? She didn't care about anybody. She exists for herself. She says what she wants. She does what she wants. She walks around the house making everyone fight with one another. She just comments, and I loved writing it because I didn't have to feel guilty. I didn't have to give her a conscience. There was no redemption or saving her. She was just a fun character to write, and as a writer, I loved writing her, so she was my favorite character.
There's one final question there.
Okay, like she said, South Africa being a complex place, a lot of cultures. In your writing, did you ever feel like an outsider to maybe a place or a culture and therefore struggle with writing about it? Or what people will think about what you write about it?
I think you're always scared about what people will think about what you're writing. And this book got sold internationally first. And I thought, in America, they're not going to know the culture as well as me, so I can get away with it. But I was scared for in South Africa because I said, I'm changing history. I'm going back into the 1930s, giving this Indian family, like they're on the ship to South Africa, they're on first class. Like, no, Indian people were not doing that in the 1930s. My grandfather was telling me like how he came in the lower decks and how it was so amazing to see people in the first class. And so I thought, I'm changing history, and so in South Africa, they're going to catch me. But like in America, they're not going to catch me. They're not going to know. They're just going to think this is a cool Gothic story about Indian people in South Africa. And I really was scared of like how it would be received here because I was changing things in history. And and also it's a complex place. There's so much going on there in terms of race, like also like who am I to write about certain things, But then I also was like, I'll write what I know. What I know is this community in this place. I know this city. I know how the interactions happen. And so I knew I was writing what I know, but I thought I'm going to get some flack in South Africa for this. And you know what? It was received fine. It was received fine. Thank goodness. I think people appreciated that, like, it's fiction. You can write, you can go back and change things if you want. You can give power where you want. You're also reclaiming that story in your own way. And I mean, thank God, because you never know as a writer what can happen. And it can be something small to you, but it can be really big to somebody else. And so, yeah, I was lucky also, I think.
Final question. This, yeah? Okay. This will sound like a gotcha question, but really it's not. For an artist preoccupied with their work and their artistic reputation, would you prefer to be much discussed but little read, or read and treasured by a few?
Yeah, he asked me this question earlier. Would you rather be much discussed and little read, or read but loved by only a few? And I was like, oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think at the heart of it, if you're writing a book that you're passionate about and you're writing a story that you really love and you have characters that you really love and you've worked on it a long time, then you want to write a story that's read. You don't want to write a story that's read by a few, but if you had a choice, loved by a few, I think. But ideally, you want everyone to love it.
Finally, guys, thank you so much for coming, but we started with a joke, we have to end with a joke. This is a knock-knock joke. You guys know how the knock-knock joke works, right? The format. So knock-knock, thank you guys for coming to Macondo. Make sure you meet Shubnum outside if you have further questions. But thank you so much for showing up and for being a good audience. Goodbye.